None of you, none of us, said those violent rioters should be pardoned. A Republican colleague said such pardons would be hard to believe, even absurd. Your former colleague, J.D. Vance, said the violent rioters should not be pardoned. Even Jim Jordan said pardons would, and I quote, focus on all the people who didn't commit any violence. Well, Trump pardoned all of them. And there's a lesson in that. Every time you think Trump would never go that far, rethink that. We all seem to agree that violence against police is unacceptable, yet more than 600 people who physically attacked Capitol Police officers were just put back on the street, part of a 1,500-person personal Trump.
You just watched Senator Whitehouse tear through the carefully constructed fiction that this administration and its Republican enablers have been selling to the American people for months now. And let me tell you something that should absolutely terrify you, because what you witnessed was not merely a rhetorical flourish or partisan grandstanding, but rather the methodical dismantling of the most dangerous presidential abuse of power in American history, executed with surgical precision and backed by the kind of irrefutable evidence that should make every single person who claims to care about democracy lose sleep tonight, because we are living through something unprecedented and catastrophic, and I need you to understand just how much worse this is than you think. On January 20, 2025, during the first day of his second term, United States President Donald Trump granted blanket clemency to all people, nearly 1,600 convicted of or awaiting trial or sentencing for offenses related to the January 6 United States Capitol attack. And you need to sit with that number for a moment, because this was not some careful case-by-case review of individuals who maybe got caught up in something beyond their control. This was a wholesale erasure of accountability for violent insurrectionists who committed heinous crimes against police officers, defending our democratic institutions. And here is where the betrayal gets absolutely sickening, because Whitehouse reminds us, and he does so with devastating effect, that J.D. Vance stated that pardons should be given to those who protested peacefully, and not those who did so violently, and Jim Jordan said pardons would focus on the nonviolent cases, but then Trump did something that reveals the fundamental contempt this administration has for truth itself, for law enforcement, for the very concept of rule of law, because more than 600 rioters had been convicted of or pleaded guilty to assault of or obstructing law enforcement officers and 170 of using a deadly weapon, and every single one of them walked free. This is where we need to talk about what Whitehouse means when he speaks of a Trump army, and I know that phrase might sound hyperbolic to some of you, but stay with me because the evidence is staggering, and it builds to something genuinely alarming. Less than 2 weeks from their pardons, they're already back committing crimes, and now provide a personal army with demonstrated willingness to commit acts of political violence at the behest of Donald Trump. And this is not theoretical fear-mongering. This is documented reality, because Matthew Huddle was shot and killed while in possession of a firearm and resisting arrest during a traffic stop just days after his pardon, and Emily Hernandez was sentenced to 10 years in prison for killing a woman and injuring her husband in a car crash just 9 days after Trump freed her, and we are watching in real time as these pardoned insurrectionists commit new crimes at an alarming rate, including plotting murder of FBI agents, child sexual assault, possession of child sexual abuse material, and reckless homicide while driving drunk. And the sheer depravity of who Trump chose to release should make your blood run cold. Let me paint you a picture of exactly who comprises this army that Whitehouse is warning us about, because the details matter, and they reveal something profoundly disturbing about what this administration values and who it seeks to empower. Daniel Joseph Rodriguez was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison for shooting Officer Michael Fanoni twice with a stun gun held to his neck, while Fanoni lay face down on the ground after being dragged into the mob, and Fanoni had a heart attack and received other injuries during the attack, and Trump pardoned him, gave him complete absolution for attempting to murder a police officer who was protecting democracy that day. And then there is David Dempsey, who used his hands, feet, flagpoles, crutches, pepper spray, broken pieces of furniture, and anything else he could get his hands on as weapons against officer, and received a 20-year sentence before Trump wiped it all away. And these are not isolated cases. These are representative examples of the systematic violence that Trump has now officially endorsed through the pardon power. And here is where the historical parallel becomes inescapable, and we need to name it clearly, because what we are witnessing is the construction of a paramilitary force, loyal not to the Constitution, or to democratic norms, or to any principle beyond personal fealty, to Donald Trump himself, And this is how authoritarianism consolidates power, not through abstract theory, but through the deliberate cultivation of violent enforcers who understand that their crimes will be forgiven as long as they serve the leader's interests. Trump's grant of clemency was described by counterterrorism researchers as encouraging future political violence. An anonymous senior official in the Justice Department described the pardons as an act of personal retribution, which gave a green light to political violence and indicated approval of the January 6 attacks. And we need to connect these dots because they form a terrifying pattern that points toward escalating political violence in the coming years. Now let us examine the Republican complicity in this nightmare, because Whitehouse lays this out brilliantly when he notes that Republicans once called these pardons absurd and unacceptable. But then when Trump did exactly what they said would be unconscionable, they fell in line like the craven authoritarians they have revealed themselves to be. Senators Jack Reed and Sheldon Whitehouse joined every member of the Democratic caucus in introducing a resolution condemning the pardons of individuals who were found guilty of assaulting Capitol Police officers. But when Senator Patty Murray requested unanimous consent for the resolution on the floor, Republicans blocked the measure. And think about what that means. Think about the moral bankruptcy, required to stand before the American people and claim you back the blue while simultaneously protecting presidential pardons for cop beaters. And this is not politics as usual. This is the complete abandonment of any pretense of principle in service of authoritarian power. Senator Patty Murray introduced a symbolic resolution to condemn Trump for pardoning the rioters, which was co-sponsored by all Senate Democrats and no Senate Republicans, though some Republican leaders, including Senators Lindsey Graham, Tom Tillis, James Lankford, Lisa Murkowski, Bill Cassidy, and Susan Collins, also expressed disagreement with the mass pardon. But here is the thing about these expressions of concern from a handful of supposedly moderate Republicans. They are utterly meaningless, performative gestures designed to give them cover with their constituents, while doing absolutely nothing to constrain Trump's authoritarian impulses, and this is the game they always play, expressing grave concern while refusing to actually use their power to stop the behavior they claim to find troubling. And meanwhile, House Speaker Mike Johnson favored the pardon, implying that the attack on the Capitol had been peaceful, and Representative Lauren Boebert spoke favorably of the pardoned people, saying she would be the first member of Congress to offer them a guided tour of the Capitol, which is so grotesque, so utterly divorced from reality, that it would be laughable if it were not so dangerous. And we need to talk about who exactly Trump pardoned beyond just the violent cop attackers, because the depravity goes so much deeper and reveals so much about the moral void at the heart of this administration. Many of the pardoned rioters had prior convictions and outstanding charges for rape, child sexual exploitation, domestic violence, manslaughter, drug trafficking, and other crimes, and I need you to really absorb that, because Trump did not just pardon people who made one bad decision on January 6th, he pardoned serial criminals with extensive histories of violence, including Edward Hemingway, who pleaded guilty to sexual battery and criminal confinement, and was initially sentenced to 3 years in prison, and Theodore Middendorf, who in May 2024 was sentenced to 19 years in prison for committing an act of sexual penetration of a 7-year-old child. And these are the patriots that Trump celebrates. These are the hostages he claims were unfairly persecuted, and this reveals everything you need to know about what this administration actually values. But wait, because it gets worse, and I need you to understand just how methodically Trump is expanding the scope of these pardons to cover essentially any crime committed by his supporters. President Donald Trump has issued a new pardon to a militia member involved in the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot, covering separate Kentucky firearms offenses that were not included in his initial Inauguration Day pardon for Daniel Wilson, who was found with 6 guns and roughly 4,800 rounds of ammunition in his home, discovered during the January 6 investigation, and prosecutors cited messages they argued showed that Wilson's plans were for a broader American Civil War, and Trump issued him a second pardon to cover the gun charges, arguing that because the search of his home was related to January 6, the illegal weapons should also be pardoned. And this is the logic of authoritarian protection rackets, where loyalty to the leader shields you from all consequences, no matter what crimes you commit. Let me bring this into sharper focus with specific examples of the ongoing danger these pardoned individuals pose, because this is not about past crimes. This is about ongoing threats to public safety and democratic institutions. Taylor Taranto, a pardoned Jan. 6 defendant who was convicted for bringing weapons to Obama's neighborhood, has returned to D.C. and has been roaming Rep. Jamie Raskin's neighborhood. And Taranto was convicted on charges related to illegally possessing guns and ammunition in his van when he was arrested near former President Barack Obama's home in Washington, D.C., and was also convicted of recording himself making a hoax threat to bomb a government building in Maryland, and the Justice Department has now asked the court to re-jail him. But think about what this means. A pardoned January 6th insurrectionist is actively surveilling and potentially threatening members of Congress, and this is exactly the kind of behavior that Whitehouse is warning about when he speaks of a Trump army ready to do violence at his call. And the sexual violence against children among these pardoned individuals is so pervasive that it demands its own reckoning, because this is not an aberration, this is a pattern. Andrew Paul Johnson was arraigned in a Florida court in October on multiple charges, including molesting a child as young as 11 years old, joining a growing list of U.S. Capitol rioters pardoned by President Donald Trump, who now face new legal trouble, and Vancouver rioters pardoned by President Donald Trump, who now face new legal trouble, and Vancouver rioters pardoned by President Donald Trump, who now face new legal trouble, and Vancouver rioters pardoned by President Donald Trump, who now face new legal trouble, and Vancouver rioters pardoned by President Donald Trump, who now face new legal trouble, and Vancouver rioters pardoned by President Donald Trump, who now face new legal trouble, and Vancouver rioters pardoned by President Donald Trump, who now face new legal trouble, and Vancouver rioters pardoned by President Donald Trump, who now face new legal trouble, and Johnson dangled the prospect that one of the children could receive money because Johnson claimed he was entitled to $10 million as part of reparations for his January 6 arrest, according to police reports. And this is the kind of predatory manipulation that these individuals engage in, and Trump freed them all knowing full well their criminal histories. Kyle Travis Colton was convicted by a federal jury for receiving child sexual abuse material, and a law enforcement search of Colton's home uncovered copious images and videos depicting graphic sexual abuse of young children, weeks after his January 6 pardon. And we are releasing pedophiles and child abusers back onto American streets because they demonstrated loyalty to Donald Trump by attacking the Capitol. Now I want to address the argument you will hear from Trump defenders that Biden also issued controversial pardons, because this false equivalence is how authoritarianism normalizes itself, by claiming everyone does it, so Trump's behavior is no worse than anyone else's, and this is a pernicious lie that we must categorically reject. Biden issued preemptive pardons to protect people from political persecution by an incoming administration that had explicitly threatened retribution. He did not pardon people who had committed violent crimes. He did not release cop beaters back onto the streets. He did not free child molesters and aspiring domestic terrorists. And the scale is not even remotely comparable. Trump issued over 1,500 pardons for January 6 defendants alone, and has continued issuing pardons for corrupt politicians and criminals at a staggering pace, including former Honduras President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted last year in a sweeping drug trafficking case and sentenced to 45 years in prison, who boasted that he would stuff the drugs up the gringos' noses and accepted a $1 million bribe to allow cocaine shipments to pass through his country. And when pressed about this pardon, Republican Senator Tom Cotton professed ignorance, saying, "I haven't spoken to the president about that pardon, and I'd have to know more about the circumstances," which is the coward's response when you know something is indefensible, but you refuse to break with your authoritarian leader. Here is what Whitehouse understands, and what every American needs to internalize immediately. Every time you think Trump would never go that far, you need to rethink that assumption, because he has consistently gone further than even his critics predicted, and the pardons are proof of this pattern. 2 inside sources stated that Trump made the decision to give blanket pardons at the last minute, just days before the inauguration, with one advisor saying Trump said, "Fuck it, release 'em all." And this casual contempt for law and order, for the rule of law, for the police officers who were beaten and brutalized, defending democracy, this is the mentality we are dealing with, and it is only going to get worse because authoritarian power, once consolidated, always expands, always seeks new targets, always escalates the violence it is willing to employ in service of maintaining control. The historical parallels here are not subtle, and scholars of authoritarianism have been sounding alarm bells for months now. Randall Eliashans, a former federal prosecutor and professor at George Washington University Law School, called the pardons an abuse of power by Trump, signaling that if they commit crimes on Trump's behalf, there would be no accountability, and Bruce Ackerman, a law and political science professor at Yale Law School, echoed the sentiment, calling the action a president pardoning his allies for their participation in a violent coup d'état. And these are not partisan hacks, these are serious scholars who understand what happens when executive power is weaponized to protect political violence, and we have seen this playbook before in other countries that descended into authoritarianism. The leader cultivates a loyal base willing to use violence. The leader protects them from legal consequences. the violence escalates as the enforcers understand they have impunity, and then democratic institutions collapse under the weight of organized political terror that faces no accountability. Let me bring this to the present moment, with devastating clarity about what is happening right now in December 2025 as we speak, because the pardon abuses have not stopped. They have accelerated and expanded in ways that reveal the underlying corruption. President Donald Trump has pardoned U.S. Rep. Henry Coelho de Laredo and his wife, ending the congressman's multi-year federal legal battle, as Coelho had faced a dozen charges of bribery, money laundering, and conspiracy, and then Trump blasted Coelho for such a lack of loyalty, suggesting the Republican president might have expected the clemency to bolster the GOP's narrow House majority heading into the 2026 midterm elections, after Coelho announced he would remain a Democrat. And this is the transactional corruption laid completely bare. Trump issues pardons expecting party switches or political favors in return, and when he does not get them, he publicly attacks the people he just pardoned. And this is mafia logic. This is protection racket mentality. This is not how Democratic presidents use the pardon power. And even some Republicans who have been reliable Trump supporters are now expressing alarm at the sheer brazenness of the corruption. North Carolina Republican Senator tells Caitlin Collins, the pardon recommendations President Trump is getting from the Department of Justice makes no sense, referring to Senator Tillis criticizing the pardon strategy, but notice that even this criticism is carefully calibrated to blame the Justice Department, rather than Trump himself, and this is the cowardice that enables authoritarianism, the refusal to directly confront the leader, even when his actions are indefensible, even when they undermine everything you claim to believe in about law and order, and supporting law enforcement. We need to talk about what happens next, because Whitehouse is right to frame this as an army, and we are already seeing the mobilization of these pardoned insurrectionists into ongoing political activity. Republican Congressman Bilirakis met with Stuart Rhodes, the founder of the far-right extremist group the Oath Keepers, in the Capitol complex to celebrate his pardon, and Trump later suggested the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers may have a place in the political conversation. And these are explicitly paramilitary organizations that were convicted of seditious conspiracy for attempting to overthrow the government, and now they are being welcomed into Republican political spaces, being celebrated by members of Congress, being normalized as legitimate political actors, and this is how fascism embeds itself in democratic systems, by bringing the violence inside, making it part of the regular political process, giving it institutional legitimacy. The threat this poses to the 2026 midterms and the 2028 presidential election cannot be overstated, because we now have approximately 1,560 defendants, including those convicted of violently assaulting police officers, who have been pardoned, and who understand that their loyalty to Trump shields them from consequences. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has warned of more violence from released Capitol rioters, including members of the Proud Boys, 3%ers, and Oath Keepers militia groups, and the 3%ers has seen a rise in recruitment following January 6 bombing, according to investigative reporting. And what do you think happens when these emboldened violent extremists are deployed to polling places in swing states? What do you think happens when they are mobilized to disrupt vote counting, or to intimidate election workers, or to create the conditions for Trump to again claim election fraud, if he loses? And this is not hypothetical fear-mongering. This is pattern recognition, based on exactly what happened on January 6th, except now these actors have been given explicit presidential approval for political violence. Let me address the silence and complicity of mainstream media and political institutions in normalizing this, because that is part of what makes Whitehouse's intervention so crucial. He is stating plainly what much of the establishment refuses to name clearly. Employees in the Justice Department and legal scholars called the pardons an unprecedented and dangerous use of the pardon that created a mockery of federal law enforcement, their work, and the U.S. justice system. And U.S. District Judge Royce Lamberth, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan, stated during a case that during his time on the bench, he could never recall such meritless justifications of criminal activity, and these are career professionals and conservative judges, not partisan Democrats, expressing genuine alarm at what Trump has done. Yet the political press largely treats this as just another controversial Trump decision, rather than what it actually is, which is the deliberate construction of an extra-legal enforcement apparatus loyal to one man, rather than to law or constitution, or democratic norms. And I want to be very clear about something that gets lost in discussions of political violence and extremism. This is not both sides. This is not equivalent to anything happening on the left. This is a specifically right-wing authoritarian project backed by the institutional Republican Party. Trump's executive action, which many GOP senators had hoped would be directed at only nonviolent offenders who entered the Capitol that day, thrust Republicans once again into a familiar posture of navigating how and when to distance themselves from the sitting president and leader of their party, and Republicans largely attempted to sidestep direct questions about whether they personally agreed with Trump's action, and this mealy-mouthed both sides in questions. Then this refusal to take a clear stand is itself a form of complicity, because it signals to Trump and to the violent extremists he has emboldened that there will be no real political cost for escalating authoritarianism. Some Capitol police officers have spoken out with devastating moral clarity about what these pardons mean, and we need to center their voices because they are the ones who bore the physical and psychological trauma of January 6th. Congressman Goldman stood beside officers Harry Dunn and Daniel Hodges to lift up their stories from January 6 when they were beaten and assaulted by a mob incited by Donald Trump. Many of the officers who were brutally assaulted that day are the same officers who protected Donald Trump this Monday, and are the same officers who protect members of Congress every day, including Speaker Johnson's detail of Capitol police officers. And imagine the psychological toll of protecting people who then turn around and celebrate your attackers, who pardon the people who tried to kill you, who invite those attackers back to the Capitol for photo opportunities. And this is moral injury on a massive scale, and it is being inflicted deliberately as part of Trump's project of rewriting the history of January 6. The rewriting of January 6 history is itself a crucial component of the authoritarian project, because if Trump can successfully redefine a violent insurrection as a peaceful protest, then there is no limit to what he can redefine, no atrocity that cannot be explained away, no crime that cannot be justified. Trump characterized the January 6 defendants as political prisoners and hostages, and promoted a revisionist history of the event by downplaying the severity of the violence and spreading conspiracy theories, while House Republicans also spread a fringe conspiracy that the FBI orchestrated the attack. And this is classic authoritarian gaslighting, telling you not to believe what you saw with your own eyes, telling you that the violence you witnessed was actually something else entirely, and the fact that this gaslighting has been at least partially successful with a significant portion of the Republican base shows how effective authoritarian propaganda can be when backed by institutional power and amplified by a complicit right-wing media ecosystem. Here is what every American needs to understand with perfect clarity right now: the next time there is political violence from the right, and there will be a next time, because Trump has given explicit permission for it through these pardons, the pattern will repeat, the violence will occur, Trump will initially equivocate or blame both sides, then he will celebrate the perpetrators as patriots and hostages, then he will pardon them, and Republicans will express concern but take no action, and the violence will escalate because this is how authoritarian power consolidates through incremental normalization of political terror, through the systematic destruction of accountability, through the cultivation of loyal enforcers who understand that their crimes will be forgiven as long as they serve the leader's interests. And we are watching this happen in real time, and most people do not fully grasp the danger because it is happening incrementally, because each individual pardon can be explained away or minimized. But when you step back and look at the pattern, when you see all 1,500 pardons together, when you see the child molesters and the cop beaters and the seditious conspirators all walking free, the picture becomes undeniable. Whitehouse ends with that devastating line, "Every time you think Trump would never go that far. Rethink that," and this is the lesson of the Trump presidency writ large. He has consistently exceeded even his critics' darkest predictions. He has gone further than anyone thought possible. He has broken norms that seemed unbreakable. He has weaponized institutions that seemed independent. He has corrupted processes that seemed sacrosanct. And the pardons are perhaps the clearest example of this pattern, because even people who understood Trump's authoritarian instincts did not think he would actually pardon the most violent January 6th insurrectionists, did not think he would release cop beaters and child molesters, did not think he would give blanket clemency to seditious conspirators, but he did all of that, and more, and the question now is what comes next, because if we have learned anything, is that Trump will always go further than you think he will, that there is no bottom to his willingness to abuse power, that there is no norm he will not break, no institution, he will not corrupt, no violence, he will not excuse in service of his own power. So what do we do with this information? How do we respond to the reality that we have a president who has constructed an army of pardoned violent extremists, loyal to him personally, willing to commit crimes on his behalf, and confident they will face no consequences? First, we name it clearly, without euphemism, without both sides, without normalizing what Whitehouse did in this clip, and what I am doing now, We call this what it is: authoritarian power consolidation through the cultivation of political violence. Second, we prepare for escalation, because Trump has shown us through his actions that he will continue pushing boundaries, that each abuse of power emboldens the next, that violence begets more violence when it goes unpunished. Third, we organize, we mobilize, we build the political power necessary to create consequences, because the only thing that stops authoritarian escalation is mass political resistance that makes the cost of continued abuses too high to bear. Fourth, we document everything, we preserve the evidence, we maintain the historical record, because Trump and his allies are actively trying to memory hole January 6th, and we cannot let them succeed in rewriting this history. And fifth, we vote in overwhelming numbers in 2026 and 2028, because electoral repudiation remains one of the most powerful tools we have to constrain authoritarian power and to send a message that political violence will not be rewarded, that corruption will not be normalized, that democracy still matters to enough Americans to defend it. This is the fight of our generation. This is the crisis that will define whether American democracy survives the 21st century, and Whitehouse has laid out the stakes with perfect clarity. Trump has built an army of violent extremists loyal to him alone. Republicans have chosen complicity over principle, and the next acts of political violence are not a question of if, but when and how severe, and all of us who care about democracy, who believe in the rule of law, who think political violence is unacceptable, have to decide right now what we are willing to do to stop this authoritarian project, because it will not stop itself. It will only escalate until it is confronted with sufficient organized political resistance, and the time to build that resistance is now, before the next election, before the next attack, before Trump goes even further than anyone thinks he will go, because he always does. The cost of waiting, the cost of normalizing, the cost of hoping this will somehow resolve itself, is a cost we cannot afford to pay.